Good evening. We have in this episode, in the Capital episode for tonight, Michael Jones. He's former White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush, and he's a leader for the U.S. Tea Party movement. He has 30 years of experience in the Middle East and North Africa on foreign affairs issues. Mr. Michael, good evening.
Good evening, Maria. Good to be with you.
I'm happy to have you in this show, and I'm gonna start asking about the meeting that's gonna happen on Tuesday. The U.S. and Iran hold indirect talks in Vienna about the U.S. Rejoining a nuclear agreement. How do you think about this step? Is it for good or for bad?
Well, we'll see how the meeting goes. I'm generally was much more supportive of the direction that I think President Trump had our Iran policy going in. Let's just walk through the issues that I think we have with the Islamic regime in Tehran. Number one, they clearly have been involved in nuclear weapons development and are involved in nuclear weapons development. The multinational agreement that was developed to prevent them from doing that has completely failed in my judgment. I'm not surprised by that. The provisions in that agreement were wholly insufficient to preclude that development. It was not a realistic agreement. Trump called it one of the worst foreign policy agreements in the history of diplomacy. I think that's pretty much spot on, at least as it relates to our lifetime. We granted the regime in Tehran billions of dollars they utilized for the weapons program, for terrorism, and for their domestic suppression. So that's all negative. Number two, they continue to be the largest state sponsor of terrorism around the world.
Exactly.
They're immensely disruptive or causing all sorts of humanitarian and human rights issues. And then the third issue, which we don't talk enough about in the United States, is the domestic suppression of human rights in Tehran. I've been involved in a number of the efforts to try to save the lives of innocent individuals in Iran who have been sentenced to die by this regime. The human rights conditions, despite this agreement, have not improved.
But the Biden administration said that they will keep the sanctions on human rights. They will think about the other sanctions, but these sanctions will keep active.
Yeah, it's very important that no concessions be made on that unless and until there are substantial agreements, verifiable, by the way, in place, not just on paper, in place as it relates to those are the three predominant issues that need to be developed. And what concerns me is that, when you look at the Obama engagement, none of those three issues improved. The nuclear weapons program continued to be developed, right? So it didn't slow that. Their engagement in terrorism expanded because they had more financial resources based on the money we provided them in freeing up, from the '79 revolution. And the human rights suppression, I don't think, it's probably as bad as it's been in at least 2 decades there from the standpoint of the arbitrary arrests, the suppression of domestic expression, and the capital sentences and imprisonments of innocent individuals, which is utterly unacceptable.
Mr. Jones, what is the way to stop the regime spreading terrorism in the region?
Well, number one is that we need to continue to maintain a very strong defense posture globally. I do not support, as President Trump did not, a prolonged presence in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. I think we largely have done what we can do over the last 2 decades in those respective areas. But clearly, our presence in the Gulf region, in interdicting their support for Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, those are all hugely important. They need to continue. We need to be very forceful on that. And then our relationships with other governments in that area that, by and large, are all opposed to Iran's agenda. I mean, with the exception of Qatar, that maintains a mysterious sort of collaborative secret relationship with Tehran that we're under no illusions about. pretty much every Middle Eastern government.
But the coalition between Qatar and Iran, it was under the supervision of Obama administration, I think.
Well, we have to make it clear to Qatar that their support for Iran is unacceptable. I think that needs to end, and we need to have provisions in place. And if and that's just a non-negotiable. I mean, this regime, this is not an act of symbolism. This is not about the Middle East. It's about American security interests around the world.
Exactly.
And this regime has defined itself as an enemy of this country. It's acting on those sentiments. It's not just domestic rhetoric. It is acting in aggressive, threatening ways. And, the world needs to decide, are they going to stand with this brutal, autocratic, tyrannical, despotic regime, or are they going to stand with the United States and the free world? And by the way, I put the EU
do you think
right.
Do you think that Biden administration and the meeting in Vienna will succeed, especially that U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, indicated that attacks by Iranian proxies on American forces in Iraq make it tougher for Biden administration to build domestic support for its new diplomatic initiative to resolve U.S.-Iran tensions?
It's only common sense, right? I mean, this regime, I want to be clear about this, where I was going with my last statement is that this is not simply an issue of what they're doing to other people and other governments around the world. That's threatening and dangerous and reprehensible enough. They are responsible and have blood on their hands for the killing of American servicemen in Iraq, substantial numbers of them. It was one of the many reasons that the United States action against Soleimani from the IRGC was completely warranted. By the way, we were told, and I was told in my comments on that this was a provocative act on Trump's behalf. I would contend that that we have rendered Iran slightly less capable of malicious activities with Soleimani's absence. And to this day, I believe it was really one of the more constructive steps that could be taken. By the way, no one ever mentions this, but he was killed in Iraq at Baghdad airport, roughly. He, under UN sanctions, was not permitted to leave the country. So he had no international right to even be where he was at that time. And of course, both in the domestic suppression and in leading that regime's aggressive terrorist activities, he was the point person. He ran this vast terroristic
attacks. Going back to Vienna, I want to know one thing: that what does it mean when Iran and the U.S. will not be in the same room, or the indirect negotiation? How it's gonna work?
Look, it's an act of symbolism, and we've dealt if you go back all the way back to 1979 and the revolution against the Shah, which, by the way, just historically, one lesson to take out of this was Carter mishandled Iran in 1979. I'm not defending the Shah. There were oppressive domestic steps that were taken there too, but it was on the basis of human rights alone that we undermined the Shah. The Shah fell. The human rights conditions actually worsened substantially in subsequent years, and now we have a regime in place that in large part we created in undermining the Shah, that is one of our great enemies in the world, an indisputed and openly hostile foreign power. The lesson to be taken there, which is a lesson I don't think we learned in Iraq involvement, was that as bad as things may look around the world in any respective country, they can always get worse. And you never pursue regime change or isolation of a regime or a government that could lead to regime change without a very clear understanding of what comes next.
But let me go back to Trump ideas or perspective. He didn't want to change the regime. He just wanted to bring Iran to the table and negotiate the same as what's happening.
Well, and this is basically the peace through strength agenda, is that you don't want to enter negotiations in some position of weakness or desperation, which now with, Iran developing nuclear weapons programs, still involved in all these things. I mean, it's not really the ideal moment to be talking to them. The ideal moment to be talking to them would be when it's their idea to initiate it. And quite honestly, I'm sort of offended with the response that they took to the Biden administration's generous offering of discussing these topics. I mean, to sort of say, well, we don't know if we'll allow the United States back into the joint agreement. I mean, of course, I don't really think they believe that. I know it's rhetoric, but it's offensive rhetoric, and it's not in the spirit of resolving anything. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm just not optimistic about this regime. I think it's
and this negotiation will fail.
Yeah, I don't see any historical basis for optimism. There's this is not our first round of talking with these guys.
Yeah,
they're not sincere. They're not honest. And the issues that we're getting them to abandon are kind of central to their whole reason for existing. I mean, you're asking them to abandon things that are in the DNA, and I don't think they're inclined to do it. But
let's talk about the region, the Gulf region, and the Biden administration, especially against Saudi Arabia. Even Saudi Arabia is a historical ally, but how do you think the initiative for Yemen, how do you see that Biden administration took it? In which way and which perspective?
Well, there's absolutely no reason or basis on fact to be removing the Houthis as a terrorist force. Let's start with that. The reason that was given was that somehow that designation was obstructing humanitarian relief in Yemen. Yemen is one of the most humanitarian. It's one of the great global crises from the standpoint of the vast humanitarian crises that they face, starvation, all sorts of issues. So it is vitally important that the international humanitarian efforts be able to continue in Yemen. But there was nothing about our designation of the Houthis as a terrorist movement that was impeding that. That was UN rhetoric, really. That there's no basis to remove the Houthis as a terrorist movement. That's what Biden administration did right away. By the way, they did it right away, upon taking office. The Houthis remain a terrorist organization, and Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen's been a matter of great debate and legitimate concern, but almost too much in the sense that I think there's a lot of focus on criticizing and isolating Saudi Arabia, which, imperfect as it may be, has done also a lot of constructive things. They, for instance, have been one of the primary supporters of humanitarian relief services in Yemen, and have obviously cooperated with the United States in vast and significant ways, and are it's a different, obviously it's a very different government than the United States, but at least over the last several years they've been a great friend for the most part, and we've had some issues obviously, and I'm not excusing those issues necessarily, but I think the improvement of Saudi relationship under Trump, which had a few major hiccups along the way, including the Washington Post reporters killing in Istanbul.
Yeah,
but it largely improved on most of the major significant strategic matters after Biden and Obama had really not done a good job of managing that relationship.
Let me ask you about United Arab Emirates. How do you think about the policy of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed in foreign affairs toward regional issues? And will the F-35 deal with the United States be shaken during the Biden administration?
The UAE is a very prosperous nation comparatively in that region, so it's a small but important country. And the initiation of the Abraham Accords and all of the accomplishments with the restoration of relationships with Israel, by and large, are constructive. I mean, Israel is a country that has legitimate sovereignty and recognition around the world. This idea that you're not going to recognize it or that somehow is an illegitimate regime when it's been there since the 40s is absurd. And I was, immensely, like Jared Kushner and the president and Mike Pompeo all did a really exceptional job diplomatically in being able to bring together those agreements. And honestly, if previous U.S. administrations had put some focus on it, I think they could have accomplished that as well, possibly. But it was of no interest to the Obama-Biden administration and really previous administrations, just like moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Got all sorts of rhetorical support from prior presidents, but, even Bush 43 and he said he was going to do it, and then when he went to do it, caved to the pressure of opposition. So kudos. Look, I really believe President Trump did a very good job and for the most part in every aspect of our foreign policy.
In the foreign affairs policy, yes, but inside America, he was somehow hated by the, I don't know, by.
Look, you're down there in D.C. You understand. I mean, we're facing institutions in academia, in media, in all of in the think tank world, largely, with a few exceptions, of a philosophy of governance and foreign policy that is completely at odds with the view that most Americans have of where we should go. Trump did not pursue a policy based on these elitist institutions' philosophies. He, in fact, properly pointed out the failures that they had, including the fact that China's ascent globally has been an immense threat to us, and correctly aligned himself with the American people's wise judgment on these things, including the fact that we can't be having 2-decade presence, in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there's just, if history indicates anything, it's that those prolonged, approaches prove both counterproductive and actually inspiring to opposition. So, and by the way, here's just a fact. In our lifetimes, Trump was the first president that did not initiate a new conflict anywhere in the world.
Yeah, he was a man of peace.
It's true that a number of these ones that he inherited are still ongoing. Couldn't bring them all to an end. That's a tough task. But
did you follow up what was going on?
First president in modern times who did not initiate
any war.
And if you go back and think, Maria, and I'm sure you followed it back in 2016. Think about how we were warned that this guy was going to set the world on fire, that he was a loose cannon, that he would blow, he would not follow traditional domestic protocol, diplomatic protocols, and that he would initiate the war. There would be all these wars and conflict.
Yeah,
just the opposite happened.
Mr. Jones, I have to end this interview with one question, if you can answer it in less than 1 minute. You said on your tweet account, I think we have a leader crisis in the country. Trump remains a very important political force. I think he needs a lot of support. What kind of support are you talking about?
Well, one man can't fix all this. For all of his great attributes, and Donald Trump's an exceptional leader with traits you don't find commonly in most people. But let me just say, if there was anything I would have done differently in the last 4 years, I think he needed more allies around his agenda who were at the center of that administration. He had too many external forces of opposition to be wasting any time arguing internally about the direction of policy. I hope as he reflects on the future, and including the grassroots movement, that he understands, the people are behind his agenda. He's got to simply align himself with the people and involve people of that mindset, in his inner policy circle. That's what's crucial.
I'm thanking you a lot, Mr. Michael Jones, for this interview. Thank you for being with us, and hope we do some more interview on the near future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for all you're doing. I appreciate it, Maria.